Ann Arbor's Talk Station 1290 WLBY. Damian Farrell, local architect, Damian on Design, each week here on our show. And Damian, great to have you back. Today's going to be really interesting. We're going to contrast the way cities are planned between our city here in Ann Arbor and the big city.
The big city, the greatest city in the world, right?
New York City. Joining us this morning is Senior Urban Designer at the New York City Department of City Planning. We welcome in Skye Duncan. Skye, what a pleasure.
Welcome.
And people are going to notice an accent, a little different than Damian's, but somewhat similar. Where are you from?
Yes, I'm from New Zealand originally, but I've been here for about the last 8 years.
And tell us a little bit about your work in New York and how that came to be for you as a way of background.
Sure. So I trained in architecture in New Zealand and worked in the private sector there before coming to New York City to complete my graduate studies up at Columbia University. And right when I finished, the Department of City Planning was creating a new urban design division under the previous chair, Amanda Burden. And so they were collecting a small team of people. And I joined the team, and I've been here ever since, so for the last 7 years. So it's been a incredible ride and just one of the most amazing cities to get to work in and to get to help shape on a daily basis.
An incredible place, the city everyone wants to go to, right, and be a part of and get a taste of and
absolutely
take a chunk out of.
Damian, this segment today on your Damian on Design came about because of some frustration you were going through locally.
Yeah, well, it started by watching Amanda Burden, who Skye just talked about. She did a fantastic TED Talk on the High Line in New York City, which is the conversion of the elevated rail into a park. And it's something I'd love to get a little bit more information and talk about if we have time with Skye as well. But I saw that, was really inspired, and at the same time was having some local frustrations. So in contrast, Skye, we have a city of 120,000 people, a downtown that's probably 9 blocks square, and a famous reputation for the getting development done or not. In the People's Republic of Ann Arbor. And so in this moment of frustration, I said to Erin, I wonder what it would be like to be a planner in New York City, for crying out loud.
Erin is a studio manager, and she was able to arrange all of this for us, Erin McNear.
So if it's that hard in a little city, what is it like in a big city? What's it like in the greatest city in the world?
Oh, well, I have to say I feel incredibly fortunate. I think I've probably got one of the best jobs in the world. The work we do here, I think, I'm speaking from an architecture and urban design perspective.
Right.
As kind of within the division of the Department of City Planning, which obviously has an incredible set of expertise, primarily planners, but also experts in demographics and GIS and, a lot of borough officers that, have the real local knowledge of their neighborhoods. And our role in urban design is we kind of work almost like mini in-house consultants. So we kind of jump, on and off projects as the borough officers need us, as they, deem our expertise necessary. We try and get involved early in the process because we find the dialogue around design, around quality, design meaning essentially just quality neighborhoods and great cities for people, that if that dialogue can be had really early in the process, it can mean that these things can be, these considerations can be incorporated at a point where it's not going to cost extra money necessarily, and it's not going to slow down a process, but it's actually about how do we be conscious about creating great cities and quality neighborhoods, no matter where you live, right? No matter what your age, no matter what your background, your ethnicity, or your zip code, everybody deserves quality, and so that's a big part of our role. And we literally jump from scales of understanding quality furniture and what it means to be comfortable sitting in a public space to a small plaza, to a site that might have 5 or 6 skyscrapers on it, to larger vision plans for, say, half of Staten Island. So we really jump between every possible scale, and we become very nimble at that, both jumping scale and then jumping between the different geographies of New York City, whether it's waterfronts or...
And on just a practical question, I have to know this. Do you guys have kind of the same process of planning commissions and design reviews and city council meetings and all that good stuff?
We do, yes, absolutely. So there's a formal process called ULIP that projects go through, and obviously everything ultimately has to go through the City Planning Commission and then to City Council to get approved. So, I think our role is, we play a number of different roles. I think we play kind of a reactionary role where people come to us, developers and applicants, and we respond and critique and try and help to shape those as quality projects. But we also proactively as a city go out and understand parts of the city that we think are really important to, either focus density if it's near transit or protect character in lower density areas. And so those are both related to specific geographies, but we also do a lot of work related to citywide thinking in terms of how do we think about resilient cities, how do we think about sustainable cities, and a lot of our work recently has also involved the consideration of public health and how do we, think when we're writing policies and we're shaping tools and we're, helping design neighborhoods, how are we actually designing a healthy quality of life for the future generations and obviously the people that live there today.
Well, and that's a great segue into active design. And reading about active
Right.
design, I mean, these are, at the face value, these are issues that we are dealing with, and I think most active cities or caring cities and towns are dealing with, which is about quality of life, the quality of the street walk. But active design goes much further. This is pretty astounding to me, the reach, if you will, of the thought and concept of active design. It goes beyond just the physical materials, planning, good ideas, texture, and all that stuff. I mean, this is big stuff. Do you want to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been an amazing area to work in for the last, I think, 6 or so years I've been working on here. What happened was initially the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene here in New York City was starting to realize the staggering epidemics that we're being faced with in terms of chronic diseases. And they realized that, while they could identify these issues and these epidemics, they couldn't, a lot of what causes these diseases, what we call diseases of energy, which is essentially an imbalance of our energy in through the food that we consume and the energy out through how physically active we are in our daily lives. And so they realized that there was this big issue, but that it was hugely tied to lifestyle and the built environment that we lived in. And so they wanted to start a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue with the people who shape the built environment, so designers, architects, landscape architects, policymakers. And in about 9 years ago, they started a program called Fit City, and it was working with our local American Institute for Architects here in New York City, as well as some academic groups. And it was really just a chance on a yearly basis to come together and brainstorm and talk about the issues that we were being faced with and what some of the solutions might be. A lot of it started understanding on the premise that the diseases of the 19th century that we were being faced with were infectious diseases, and that these diseases, in fact, the solution or a lot of the impact to dropping these disease rates were through design and policy of the built environment. So things like thinking about our water system and creating Central Park in New York City, for example. A Department of Sanitation allowed streets to suddenly be cleaned and not have big puddles of water where mosquitoes could sit and breathe. Tenement Housing Act and the zoning resolution kind of helped to shape the physical form of the buildings, and of course the subway allowed us to spread our density out. So actually these design and policy interventions had a huge drop in the infectious disease rate. So they went from around 57% down in 1880 to just over 11% in 1940. So that's a drop of 45% of infectious disease rates. And these are statistics from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. And that drop was before the widespread use of antibiotics. So it really kind of points to the power of design and policy in the built environment.
Very powerful.
So if that was the 19th century version of this, let's fast forward to today and how that premise of dealing with things through design, environmental design, can relate to the challenges we have today. What are you doing today?
Absolutely. Well, so what happened was out of one of the Fit City conferences came a commitment to produce a document called the Active Design Guidelines. And what was also revolutionary about this was that it was a very collaborative process in city government. So it was the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, Design and Construction, Transportation, and of course city planning, partnering with academics to produce this active design guidelines. And what these guidelines did, we released them in 2010, To be honest, then there's nothing revolutionary in them. It's the premise of them is basic good design. What it does is it ties these design principles and strategies to strong evidence, to emerging evidence, and to best practices from the health evidence world. And so, what the things that are covered in the active design guidelines really jump from the larger scale of thinking about land use and density. So how do we concentrate density and new development in areas near transit? In New York City, for example, by the year 2030, under Plan NYC, we're expected to have 1 million new people by the year 2030. Now, we certainly don't want 1 million new cars on our roads, so it's really important that we think strategically, how can we allow these people to live and work and play and go to school within a short walk of a train station or a bus station? And how do we make sure that the mix that we provide, the land use mix, means that they can walk to a supermarket and get access to healthy food, that they can walk to school, that they can walk to a local park and maybe a restaurant to meet friends. It doesn't mean that no one can use cars and that cars are evil, but how do we, through the way we design our neighborhoods, offer choices to people so that they don't have only driving as an option.
Yeah. And you said something really key there, and that is choice. And I think part of the problem in Ann Arbor is there is a segment of Ann Arbor that really feels that our officials and others pushing this agenda are trying to get cars out of here. And here we sit in the motor capital of the world, right next to Detroit. So I think it's that balance of, how do you have bicyclists and pedestrians? We had a pedestrian crosswalk put in recently, much to the consternation of many motorists out there. It really created a lot of havoc. I don't know how you balance all of that. How are you doing it in New York City, Skye Duncan?
Well, we're pretty lucky, I think, as a starting point in New York City that we've got this kind of urban grid that gives us a great scale to walk with, which, we say has great walkable bones to it. But a lot of other cities also have great walkable bones, and a lot of cities are also starting to transform, transform their streets and their built environment to offer these choices. So it's really thinking about how do we think about walkability in terms of creating great sidewalks? How do we offer choices of options where people can cross a street or sit down on a bench or be shaded by a tree in the heat of summer? Actually, a lot of these premises were developed into a document that we did following up from the active design guidelines called Shaping the Sidewalk Experience, which is, you can download for free on the New York City Planning website. And this really looks at that environment. So how do we think about pedestrians in the sense that flipping the hierarchy? We've spent decades designing with cars at the center of how we design our cities. Now, ultimately, if you think about it, cities are for people, right? And that means people on foot, people on bike, people in cars, and people in transit. So we need to kind of flip the hierarchy chart of what we've been thinking about and put people on top. Yeah. People on foot are our most vulnerable form, and it's also the scale that we all intimately experience our city. So we have to keep that scale in mind in terms of offering benches, offering shorter crossing distances, providing green, providing active, interesting building facades so that when people walk along the sidewalk, they don't feel bored. I don't know if you've ever walked down a street, it's a block, let's say it's, 1,000 feet long, right, and there's nothing happening, right? It's empty lots and it's blank facades, and it feels like forever. Yeah, so you feel like walking. You're not going to make that choice to walk because unless you really have to. So how do we create environments where that 1,000 feet that you're walking down, you don't even notice that you've just walked 10 minutes because it's interesting and it's engaging and you can stop if you need a rest and you're shaded and it works with the context and the weather conditions that are there. And the key is that if we can make more of these environments where people are enticed to walk through design, through a quality environment, not that they have to, then they're going to start to choose to do it because ultimately,
it's such a pleasant experience.
Younger people are getting less driver's licenses. People want to walk. We know through health evidence that actually small bouts of 10-minute walking help us contribute to our daily needs of physical activity. So to go to the gym for an hour is great, but also to walk to a bus stop is great, and walk home again is great.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of your notes from the Center for Active Design, and actually we have a couple of copies here. of the tools and resources, the active design shaping the sidewalk experience.
Oh, great!
And
You've got a copy.
Yeah, we have 2 copies here in the studio with us, and this for our listeners. I mean, this is a serious document. It's what, a couple of 100 pages maybe.
Yeah. Yes,
it's
it is.
and it's magnificent. And
Oh, thank you.
but just looking at some of our summary notes, I'd like to just read very quickly for our listeners, just the active buildings part. And there's a purpose for doing this. So the bullet points very quickly: stairs that are accessible, visible, attractive, and well lit. Wayfinding signage that prompts and encourages stair use. Interesting circulation spaces that promote walking. Space for lactation support. Kitchen and casual eating spaces to promote healthy eating. Outdoor bicycle parking and secure indoor bicycle storage. On-site exercise facilities and play spaces. On-site gardening opportunities. Sidewalk and facade elements that enhance the pedestrian realm, such as street trees, etc., etc. Access to indoor and outdoor walking trails. Nearby and accessible public transit. It's interesting to me that the first 3 of those are about stairs, and we're actually going to, Lucy Ann, we're going to be having a guest later in the year because Michigan has a stair week, which is being promoted by the American Institute of Architects here in Michigan.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and it's coming up at the end of August, in fact, and we're going to be talking about that in one of our shows. But it's interesting that at the Center for Active Design focuses on the ability of stairs, and I'm assuming this includes things like lobbies, public spaces, just inside and outside of buildings, to encourage people to do the exercise.
Yep.
Quick question for you. This whole issue of security, and particularly in New York City, right? Has that been difficult to work with in trying to achieve some of these things right at that edge between the public realm and buildings? Or are people adapting?
I think people are adapting. I think where the security, I'm not sure if you mean, so security within a building, in access to stairs, we have had to kind of work through a few challenges with
Sure.
that. If you think of a commercial building where there's multiple tenants on a floor, people
Right.
don't necessarily want people wandering up and down, but opening up staircases through things like visibility, making the doors fireproof glazing, allowing magnetic door openers is a key part of enticing people to use a stair within a building. We've got
Yeah.
some great examples of people putting up a bit of artwork, people putting speakers and putting music in the staircases that really can make a world of difference to entice people to use it.
Yeah.
And that in conjunction with stair prompts. I think in terms of security, when we talk about the building and the public realm, it's actually a huge passion of mine is this one point where we think about how every building comes down and touches the sidewalk.
Yeah.
A lot of times, and you guys are obviously speaking from an architectural point of view, and this was the premise of the sidewalks document that we did was, if you think about walkability and sidewalks and streets, typically they live within the realm of transportation agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And what we wanted to do is say, listen, there's great things happening around the world in terms of transportation agencies and rethinking streets. But as architects, right, we're often kind of taught to design objects in a site. And we don't really understand that if you think about the sidewalk like a room with a person at the middle of it, and that room has 4 planes to it. The ground plane is obviously critical because without it, you can't walk, safely without
Yeah.
being in the roadbed.
Right.
But a huge part of that room is shaped by architects and how they design their buildings to come down and meet the sidewalk. So
Yeah.
every time they put pen to paper, every time they design a window or the details of a column or the rhythm of the entrances, the scale of the storefronts, if you think about if you have a massive ground floor big box and you only have one entrance,
Horrible. Yeah.
that's not a very pleasant place to walk. So how do we as architects think creatively about things like, sure, we need our big boxes, but how do we maybe put smaller retail scale along that sidewalk so that we still get the large square footage for the big
Yeah.
box, but for the pedestrian realm, instead of walking past one entrance and a bunch of blank windows or walls, we walk past 5 different stores.
Yeah.
And, breaking down that scale to the human, adding kind of this level of complexity at the point that the buildings touch the sidewalk, putting the regular entrances, and thinking about variety, right? We get bored very easily. So how do we provide a level of variety for people
That's a
walking
really good
down
point.
the street?
Yeah, the boredom is a
And-
big thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So keeping people engaged through
And stimulated
through their
without knowing it.
environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they're going to walk. They're going to keep walking because it's great and it's enticing and it's drawing them
It's
in.
fun. It's interesting.
What about the developers, though? Are they gravitating to this and these?
They are. We've started to see some wonderful examples and many examples actually in affordable housing developments here in New York City that are embracing the active design guidelines and a lot of these principles. I think developers are now realizing that their businesses, their property, the value is much higher if they can think about quality, that people want to work and live in places that feel good. With the globalizing world, young people, young professionals have choices to live or work wherever they want.
There is a value to good design.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Increasingly, they want to be in a place that feels great.
Skye,
And
you call
so
these guidelines, though. Are these policy or they have to adhere to this?
Right. So they're a set of guidelines. They're not policy per se. Some of our city agencies, like our design and construction agency, have adopted the guidelines as kind of a requirement for projects that come through, like our city buildings. We're also working on a follow-up document called Opportunities for Health and Zoning, and it looks at where we can take things like the guidelines and look at if people wanted to take an extra step to think about a policy strategy, how we might do that. So, for example, the Active Design Guideline says think about bicycle infrastructure and safe places to park your bike. And in 2009, here in New York City, Department of City Planning, we changed our zoning resolution and our policies so that every new multifamily residential or commercial building actually had to provide bicycle parking. So we changed the regulations and we, in this case, discounted or kind of removed the floor area count for the developers. But, we as policymakers, there's many different roles for designers, for policymakers. Often our codes were written 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah. Yep.
And, they were at the time where we designed cities for cars. So a big role is also looking at where the impediments exist.
Yeah.
In our policies and our codes and removing those impediments for people to do, to embrace the best practices and then in some cases incentivize certain practices as well.
Skye Duncan, Senior Urban Designer at the New York City Department of City Planning. Fascinating look at how the big city is handling these very same issues that we've been grappling over here in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, it's very, as always, I've got through 1/3 of my questions, so we need to do another show, which we will. But it is interesting, very similar issues, big city to small, Midwest town city, and I just admire what the scale at which you guys work is. I know how hard it is in a small town like this. What you guys are doing is so inspiring, and you're making this incredible progress in this environment. And as a little tidbit to close on today, we actually have an area here in Ann Arbor called Barton Hills, which was laid out by Olmsted. And for a while, I was the Barton Hills planner, and it was with great delight and a lot of fun. Got to do all my research to restore the planning guidelines of this area that was developed at the turn of the century by doing all my research in the New York City Library and literally rewriting the zoning code to follow what Olmsted's original vision was for Barton Hills.
Wow, that's great.
And it's probably the most desirable place, if you will, in Ann Arbor to have a home, because it is on the river and so on. But anyway, Skye, we will get back to you because there's still so much to talk about. This is so fascinating.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Anytime. And, I think for you guys, just as the kind of last point, I guess, a lot of people say to us, well, you're in New York, and New York's kind of its own animal, and we can't do that in other places because we're smaller and we don't have the same infrastructure. But I think, as we go around the world and go around the country, realizing that, again, cities are for people. And if we keep that premise of judging from the pedestrian perspective at the heart of everything we do and the decisions we make, then, we really can't go wrong. And ultimately, our human bodies within a small range are relatively similar, right? And we all have similar senses. And so whether you're doing a small 30,000 town or 120,000 person city or an 8 million person city, I think keeping this premise at mind means a lot of these principles can be shared and borrowed.
Well,
from
we'd
each
love
other.
for you to come walk
Yeah.
our sidewalks and give your
Anytime.
perspective.
I want to talk about Hudson Yards and prefab and the High Line and skinny skyscrapers and
I
all sorts
know.
of things. So we
Lots
have
of
more
fun
to chat,
projects
and,
going
and
on.
we'll definitely be back. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Skye.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Skye Duncan, she's worked on many of those projects and more and helping to improve the health and sustainability of New York's fabric. And she is also a professor, Skye Duncan, senior urban designer at the New York City Department of City Planning. On Damian on Design with local architect Damian Farrell each week here on the Lucy Ann Lance Show, 1290 WLBY.